Thank you so much, Kelly O'Hara. My father was one of your biggest fans. He loved that song, and he would have been delighted to hear you sing it just for him. I'm Michael Gelb, Arthur's oldest son, and I want to welcome you on behalf also of my brother Peter and his 4 devoted grandchildren, and thank you for being here with us this afternoon. By the way, that infant seated on the desk in the photo of my dad and his typewriter is me. It's proof that I've been a lifetime observer of my father in action. And I have to say that as a very young child, I got a kick out of listening to him on the phone, giving a reporter an assignment, and telling him exactly what he expected from him in the way of a story. I had my dad to myself for 2.5 years, and even after Peter was born, he made time on his days off for us to have adventures, just him and me. We would spend hours walking together through Central Park, which I saw through his eyes as a dense forest. He delighted me by naming the wooded paths we traveled as our secret way. An encounter with a man and his dog, even a squirrel scooting across our path, was an exciting event. Looking back, I realized that he brought to our walks the same imagination and creativity and enthusiasm that he brought to his work at the Times. He truly loved Central Park. He told me about how his own parents had frequently gone on outings there with him and his brother. He described how, during summer heat waves, they had sometimes spread blankets on the lawn and slept there overnight to escape the stifling temperature of their Bronx apartment, along with other families from their Bronx neighborhood. As I grew into my teens, I was more and more amazed that this father of mine, who seemed to me so guileless, gentle, and kind, could be the same person who could manage a great newspaper with all the pressures and conflicts that entailed. I was often perplexed, not to say overwhelmed, by his professional personality. Sadly, much as I still loved and admired him, I began in my teens the obligatory march of rebellion. I thought he was too demanding. He didn't like my long hair. He didn't appreciate the Beatles. I wasn't getting good enough marks at school. Why did I always avoid family outings? I was sulky and uncommunicative, all the usual. Peter was actually way ahead of me in personal revolt. He was also more vocal about it, even at the age of 9. When my parents told him one day that he had to tidy his room before he would be allowed to sit down at the dinner table, he refused. "The dictatorship is over," he shouted. Those were my sentiments exactly. It took longer than it should have for me to finally appreciate my dad, but no longer than it took for him to finally appreciate the Beatles. But I was at last able to see him and enjoy him as the brilliant, creative, ambitious, and highly motivated man he was. A man whose incredibly agile mind continued to function non-stop, almost to his last breath. A man who never forgot where he came from, and who remained generous, humble, and approachable his entire life. About 6 months ago, I started reading the manuscript of my parents' as yet unpublished final biography of Eugene O'Neill. It's a long read, and it was only in the last weeks of my dad's life that I reached the chapter in which O'Neill's own father, James, a matinee idol of the late 1880s and early 1900s, was suffering a prolonged and painful death. O'Neill, growing up, had often been at odds with his father, and the two had only recently been reconciled. O'Neill wrote to his wife from James O'Neill's bedside, musing on his father's fate. I'd like to quote from that letter. "And dear God, why? Surely he is a fine man as men go, and I can look back on to a long life in which he has kept an honorable faith and labored hard to get from nothing to the best attainment he knew. Surely the finest test of that attainment is the great affection and respect that all bear him who knew him. I don't believe he ever hurt a living thing intentionally. And he certainly has been a husband to marvel at and a good father according to his lights. I know these are the conventional virtues that are inscribed on tombstones, but he is the one person in a million who deserves them. Perhaps these virtues are so common in cemeteries because they are so rare in life. My own father's life was far more successful than James O'Neill's, and his death was gentler. But it was the words of a son for a beloved father that resonated deeply for me. They mirrored my awareness of my own father's vitality, his warmth, his generosity and kindness as a husband, father, friend, and colleague. The depth of the respect and affection of almost all who knew him in any capacity was evident in the outpouring that was generated by the brilliant front-page obituary written by Dad's colleague Sam Roberts in the New York Times. Just one more thing I want to mention. My dad's friends and colleagues knew him as gregarious, outspoken, exuberant, at times even boisterous. But he also had a private spiritual side that few outside his immediate family ever saw. Growing up, my brother and I came to understand that our dad's faith had been absorbed from his immigrant parents, to whom he was devoted. He embraced the conservative Judaism that they practiced and clung to it all his life. Dad insisted that my brother and I become bar mitzvah, but soon after, we both began resisting ritual attendance at religious services and sorrowfully abandoned the idea that we would ever follow in his path. But he himself continued to quietly follow in his parents' footsteps. To the end of his life, he faithfully attended the high holiday services at the Central Synagogue. He fasted during Yom Kippur, lighted yahrzeit candles for his departed loved ones, and celebrated Passover with as many family members as were within traveling distance of home. And when none of them were, with just my mom in their kitchen, the two of them cozily reading aloud from the Haggadah and nibbling horseradish and matzah. I know that my father's indomitable spirit, his curiosity, critical eye, inquisitiveness, his ability to see the big picture, his optimism, his profound honesty, live on in his family and in the many, many people he touched during his lifetime, many of you among them here today. And he's probably looking down on me now as I speak, thinking about how we can improve this little talk of mine in some judicious editing. I love you, Dad, and we'll be forever grateful that I had you for a father. Thank you.